My old landlady waited 18 years for me to come back. She never rented my room. I'm Daniel Marsh, 45 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed that every physical trace of who I'd been before the age of 27 had been erased from the earth. Every book, every photograph, every handwritten letter, every sketch I'd drawn during the years I spent trying to become someone worth being, all of it, gone. That's what I'd accepted. That's the story I told myself for 18 years, that the young man who'd lived in a rented room on Belmont Street in Portland, Oregon, had simply ceased to exist, and the only version of him that remained was the hollowed-out middle-aged one sitting in a therapist's office in Raleigh, North Carolina, trying to explain why he couldn't stop dreaming about a house he'd never see again. I was wrong about almost everything. But let me go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't make sense without context, and the context is the kind that takes a while to lay out properly. In 2006, I was 27 years old and living in the Hawthorne district of Portland. I'd moved there from Medford, Oregon, when I was 23, chasing the vague notion that I could make a living as a graphic designer while spending my evenings painting. I didn't have family money. My father had left when I was 11, and my mother, a woman who loved me in the abstract but couldn't manage the practical, had died of liver failure when I was 19. I had a half-sister in Tucson whom I spoke to maybe once a year. I had no safety net, no inheritance, no family home to retreat to. What I had was a room. It was the second floor of a narrow Victorian on Belmont, owned by a woman named Evelyn Calloway. She was 61 when I moved in, sharp-eyed. With silver hair she kept in a braid and hands that were always doing something, kneading bread, pruning roses, reupholstering a chair she'd found at Goodwill. She owned the house outright, had raised 2 sons in it, both of whom had moved away and rarely called. Her husband, Gerald, had died in 1998. She lived alone on the first floor and rented the 2 upstairs rooms to what she called young people who need a place to land. My room was $475 a month, utilities included. It had a bay window that faced east, a radiator that clanked like a percussion section, and exactly enough space for a twin bed, a desk, a bookshelf, and my easel. It was the first place that had ever felt like mine. Evelyn wasn't a landlady in the traditional sense. She didn't slide invoices under the door or maintain professional distance. She left plates of food outside my room when she heard me working late. She asked about my paintings, genuinely asked, not politely. She told me I had talent, and when I said I wasn't sure that was true, she said, "Talent isn't the thing you're sure about. It's the thing you can't stop doing." I lived there for 4 years. During that time, I accumulated what felt like the archive of my early adulthood. Boxes of sketchbooks. A collection of vinyl records I'd found at garage sales. Letters from a college friend named Marcus who was teaching English in South Korea. A journal I kept intermittently, filled with the kind of raw, embarrassing honesty that only exists when you're writing for no audience. Prints I'd made at a community darkroom. A quilt my mother had sewn for me when I was 15, the only thing of hers I'd kept. My original portfolio, 12 pieces on heavy cardstock that represented the best work I'd ever done. All of it was in that room when everything fell apart. The collapse happened in stages, the way they usually do. In early 2007, the design firm I worked for lost its biggest client and laid off half the staff. I picked up freelance work, but it wasn't enough. I started missing rent, not by much, but consistently. Evelyn told me not to worry about it. "You'll catch up," she said. "People always do." Then, in the spring of 2008, I got involved with a woman named Tessa Garland. Tessa was magnetic and manipulative in equal measure, the kind of person who makes you feel like the center of the universe right up until she makes you feel like dust. Within 6 months, she convinced me to move into her apartment across the river in Beaverton, co-sign a lease on a car I couldn't afford, and lend her $4,200, every dollar I had in savings, for a business opportunity that turned out to be a pyramid scheme run by her ex-boyfriend. When I told Evelyn I was moving out, she stood in her kitchen with her hands in a mixing bowl and looked at me for a long time. "Are you sure about this, Daniel?" she asked. "Not judgmental. Not controlling. Just careful." "I'm sure," I said. I was an idiot. I packed a bag with clothes and my laptop. The rest, the boxes, the books, the records, the portfolio, the quilt, I left in the room. "I'll come back for it next weekend," I told her. "I just need to get settled first." I didn't come back next weekend. I didn't come back the weekend after that. By the fall, I was drowning. Tessa had maxed out a credit card she'd opened in my name. The car got repossessed. I lost the freelance clients I'd been barely holding onto because I couldn't focus, couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. Tessa and I imploded in a screaming argument in November 2008, and I left Beaverton with nothing but my laptop bag and a duffel of clothes, couch surfing with a friend named Ray who gave me 3 weeks before he needed the space back. I should have gone back to Evelyn's. I know that now. But I was ashamed. I owed her 3 months of back rent, $1,425, and I couldn't face her. In my mind, I'd already burned that bridge. I'd already lost everything in that room. I told myself she'd probably cleaned it out weeks ago, given the stuff to Goodwill, rented the room to someone responsible. Someone who deserved it. In January 2009, my half-sister in Tucson offered me a place to stay while I got on my feet. I left Portland on a Greyhound bus with 2 bags and a credit score in the low 400s. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I didn't contact Evelyn. I disappeared. Update 1, March 2026. The return. 18 years. That's how long it took. In those 18 years, I rebuilt my life in the slow, unglamorous way that people do when they've hit bottom and have no choice but to start climbing. I worked warehouse jobs in Tucson, then got my graphic design certifications updated at Pima Community College. I moved to Raleigh in 2013 for a job at a mid-sized marketing firm. I worked my way up. I started therapy. I paid off the debts, repaired my credit, built savings. I got married to a woman named Claire in 2018, and we had a daughter, Lily, who turned 5 in January. I was stable. I was functional. But there was a hollow place in me that therapy could identify but never quite fill, the sense that some essential piece of my history had been amputated. Not just the objects, but what they represented. Proof that I had once been a young man with ambitions, that I had once made things with my hands, that someone had once told me I had talent and I had almost believed her. I hadn't spoken to Evelyn in 18 years. I didn't know if she was alive. In February 2026, I got an email from Marcus, the friend from college, the one who'd written me letters from South Korea. He was back in Portland, running a non-profit, and he'd been trying to track me down for years. "Man," he wrote, "I drove past Belmont Street the other day. That old Victorian is still there. I think your landlady's still there too. I saw someone in the garden." I sat at my desk in Raleigh and read that email 4 times. Then I closed my laptop and didn't think about it for a week. That's not true. I thought about it constantly. Claire was the one who finally said it. We were lying in bed on a Sunday morning, Lily between us watching cartoons on a tablet, and I told Claire the whole story. The room, the boxes, the quilt, Evelyn. All of it. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her, and then she said, "Daniel, you need to go back. It's been 18 years. She probably doesn't even remember me. You need to go back." I booked a flight to Portland for the 2nd week of March. Update 2, The door on Belmont Street. Portland in March is gray and dripping, the cherry blossoms just starting to show pink against slate skies. I rented a car at PDX and drove across the river to Belmont, and I swear the city hadn't changed as much as I had. The coffee shops were different, the signs were newer, but the bones were the same. The Victorian was still there. Smaller than I remembered, the way childhood places always are, even though I wasn't a child when I lived there. The paint was different, pale blue now instead of the cream I remembered, and the porch railing had been replaced. But the rose bushes were still there, dormant and thorny, and the mailbox still had the hand-painted house number that Evelyn had done herself. I sat in the rental car for 20 minutes. I almost drove away twice. When I finally walked up the porch steps and knocked, I expected a stranger. I expected to be told that Evelyn had moved, or passed away, or that the house had been sold. I expected closure of the sterile, impersonal kind. The door opened, and Evelyn Calloway looked at me. She was 79. Her hair was fully white now, still in a braid. She was thinner, smaller, leaning slightly on a cane with a carved wooden handle. But her eyes were exactly the same, that particular shade of attentive gray that always made me feel like I was being seen rather than just looked at. She studied my face. I watched recognition move across hers like light crossing a room. "Daniel," she said. Not a question. "Hi, Evelyn." She didn't cry. Neither did I, though it was close. She opened the door wider and stepped aside, and I walked into a house that smelled exactly the way I remembered, lavender and old wood and something baking. We sat in her kitchen. She made tea. We talked for an hour about surfaces, her health, arthritis, a knee replacement in 2019, otherwise sound, my family. She asked to see pictures of Lily and studied them with genuine attention. The neighborhood, more expensive, more condos, fewer families. She told me that one of her sons, David, had moved back to Portland in 2015 and helped with the house. The other, Stephen, was in San Diego and called on Sundays. Then there was a pause. The kind of pause that has weight. "Evelyn," I said, "I owe you an apology. I owe you 18 years' worth of apology. I left without. I just disappeared. I never paid what I owed you. I never called. I never explained. I was ashamed, and I was selfish, and I am so sorry." She set her teacup down and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Daniel, I want to show you something." She stood up slowly, gripping the table edge, and gestured for me to follow. We walked to the staircase, the same narrow staircase I'd climbed thousands of times, and she pointed upward. "Go on up. Second door on the right. You remember." "Evelyn, what?" "Go look." I climbed the stairs. The carpet had been replaced, but the banister was the same, and the light that came through the hall window was the same, and the sound of the stairs under my feet was the same. I stopped outside the second door on the right. My door. My old door, with its glass knob and its slightly warped frame. I opened it. Everything was there. Update 3, the room that waited. I need you to understand what I mean by everything. The twin bed was still pushed against the far wall, made up with the same navy comforter I'd left on it. My bookshelf was still beside the window, and my books were still on it. The dog-eared copy of Invisible Man, the Raymond Carver collection, the oversized Rothko monograph I'd bought with money I didn't have. My desk was still in the corner, and on it were 2 sketchbooks, a tin of drawing pencils, and a ceramic mug I'd used for water when I painted, still faintly stained with pigment. The boxes were stacked against the closet wall. 3 of them, taped shut, with my handwriting on them in black marker. Records, letters/journals, portfolio. The quilt, my mother's quilt, was folded on the end of the bed. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been opened, discarded, rearranged. The room looked like I'd stepped out for coffee 18 years ago and simply hadn't come back yet. I sat down on the bed and put my hands over my face, and I wept in a way I hadn't wept since my mother's funeral. Not the polite, controlled kind of crying you do in a therapist's office. The kind that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it was there until it broke open. When I finally went back downstairs, Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded, waiting. "You kept everything," I said. My voice was wrecked. "Of course I did. For 18 years. 17 years and 8 months, but yes." "Evelyn, why?" She picked up her teacup, took a sip, set it down. "Because they weren't mine to throw away. They were yours. And because I thought you'd come back. Nobody keeps a room for 18 years. Nobody does that. I had the space. It wasn't costing me anything but a room I didn't need. And every time I thought about cleaning it out, I'd remember those sketchbooks, and that quilt, and I'd think, he's going to want those someday. He might not know it yet, but he's going to want them. The rent I owed you." "Stop it. Evelyn, I owed you $1,400. Daniel Marsh, if you try to hand me money right now, I will hit you with this cane. That isn't why I kept your things. I didn't keep a ledger. I kept a room." I stared at her. "But how did you know? How did you know I'd come back?" She looked at me with those gray eyes, and she smiled, not a sentimental smile, but a practical one, the kind she always wore when she was stating something she considered obvious. "Because you left your mother's quilt. Nobody walks away from that forever. Not if they're the kind of person I think they are." Update 4, what the boxes held. I spent the next 3 days in Portland. I called Claire the first night and told her everything, and she cried on the phone, which made Lily concerned, which made me cry again, and for 5 minutes we were all just a mess of tears and crackling cell service. I went through the boxes slowly, one at a time, sitting on the floor of that room with the bay window open and the March air coming in cold and damp. The records were all there. 47 vinyl albums, ranging from Miles Davis to Fleetwood Mac to a scratched copy of The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill that Marcus had given me for my 25th birthday. I held each one like it was made of glass. The letters from Marcus were tied with a rubber band that crumbled when I touched it. I read them one by one. They were funny and earnest and full of the particular honesty that exists between 2 people in their 20s who haven't yet learned to be careful with language. In one of them, dated 2006, he'd written, "You're the only person I know who takes being alive seriously enough to paint about it. Don't stop." I'd stopped. My journal was in the second box. I opened it to a random page and found an entry from September 2007. "Evelyn told me today that the problem with talented people is that they think talent is the point. She said the point is showing up. She said Gerald used to say that about farming. The crop doesn't care if you're inspired. It needs you to show up." I'd forgotten she'd said that. I'd forgotten a lot of things. But the thing that broke me open all over again was the portfolio. 12 pieces on heavy cardstock, protected by tissue paper, stored flat at the bottom of the third box. I pulled them out one by one and laid them across the floor. They were good. They were better than I remembered. Not professional level. They had the raw, unfinished quality of someone still learning their voice, But they had energy and intention and the particular urgency of someone who was making art because they couldn't figure out how else to say what they needed to say. I hadn't painted in 12 years. I told myself I wasn't an artist, that it had been a youthful hobby, that the practical concerns of adulthood had reasonably crowded it out. But sitting on that floor, looking at work I'd done when I was 25, I understood that I hadn't stopped painting because I'd grown up. I'd stopped because I'd been ashamed, and shame doesn't just take your confidence, it takes your capacity to make things. You can't create when you believe you don't deserve to exist. Evelyn brought me lunch on a tray, tomato soup and grilled cheese, the same thing she'd made me 100 times when I was young. She looked at the paintings spread across the floor and said, "You were always better than you thought. I should have come back sooner. You came back when you were ready. That's the only time that matters." On the second day, I sat down with Evelyn and David, her son, a quiet, solid man in his late 50s who clearly adored his mother, and had a real conversation. I told them I wanted to pay for the years of unused rent. David started to wave it off, but I insisted. "I'm not doing this out of guilt," I said. "I'm doing it because it's right." Evelyn kept my things safe for 18 years. The room sat empty. That has value, and I want to acknowledge it. We agreed on a figure, $8,500. It wasn't 18 years of rent, that would have been over $100,000, which was both absurd and beyond my means, but it was what I could offer, and Evelyn, after significant protest, accepted it as a contribution to the Rose Garden Fund. David told me later, privately, that his mother had turned down renters for that room at least 4 times over the years. Each time, she told him the same thing, "That room is Daniel's. He'll be back." "We thought she was being sentimental," David admitted. Stephen and I even argued with her about it a few times. That room could have generated income, and as she got older and her expenses grew, but she wouldn't budge. She said she'd made a promise. "She never made me a promise," I said. David looked at me. "She made one to herself." Update 5. Going home with everything. I shipped the boxes to Raleigh. All 3 of them, plus the quilt, plus the records, packed carefully with Evelyn's help. She supervised the packing the way she supervised everything, with precision and occasional pointed commentary. "You're not putting the Rothko book on top of the Carver. Rothko's heavy. You'll crush the spine." On my last morning in Portland, I sat with her in the kitchen one more time. The March light was coming through the window, catching the dust motes, and she was doing what she always did, her hands busy, this time peeling apples for a pie. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." I always answer honestly. It's one of my least popular qualities. "Did you ever worry that you were wrong? That I wasn't coming back?" She put down the peeler and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every year around November, I'd think about it. November was when you left, so it was always on my mind then. And I'd go upstairs and open the door and look at the room, and I'd ask myself, is this foolish? Am I an old woman keeping a shrine?" What was the answer? The answer was always the same. It wasn't a shrine. It was a room with someone's things in it. And until that someone told me he didn't want them, they were going to stay right where they were. She picked up the peeler again. "Besides, I was right. You're here. I'm here." She smiled. "Took you long enough." I hugged her on the porch when I left. She felt small and birdlike in my arms, and I had to fight the sudden, ferocious urge to apologize again for every lost year. But she told me to stop apologizing, so I just held her and said, "Thank you, Evelyn. For everything. For the room. For waiting. You're welcome, dear. Now go home to that baby and that wife and do something with those sketchbooks." I didn't keep them so they could sit in a closet in North Carolina. Epilogue. What I found when I unpacked. The boxes arrived in Raleigh on a Thursday. Claire helped me unpack them in the living room while Lily sat on the floor and examined every item with the reverent fascination of a 5-year-old who has just discovered that her father had a life before she existed. "Daddy, who drew this?" she asked, holding up one of the portfolio pieces, a charcoal sketch of a woman sitting in a kitchen, her hands in a mixing bowl, a braid over one shoulder. "I did, sweetheart. A long time ago. It's pretty." "Who is she?" "She's someone who believed in me before I learned how to believe in myself." Claire found the quilt at the bottom of the last box and unfolded it carefully. It was a patchwork of floral prints and solid blues, slightly faded, with my mother's stitching visible in every seam, not perfect, but deliberate. Claire spread it over the back of the couch and stood looking at it. "This is the quilt," she said. "That's the quilt. The one your mother made. The one I thought was gone forever." She put her arms around me, and Lily immediately squeezed between us, and we stood there in our living room in Raleigh, North Carolina, surrounded by boxes and records and sketchbooks, and a quilt that had waited 18 years in a room kept by a woman who'd believed, against all evidence and reason, that I would come back for it. I started painting again last week. Nothing ambitious, just small studies, color experiments, the kind of preliminary work you do when you're relearning a language you used to speak fluently. I set up a corner of the garage with an easel and my old pencil tin and a set of acrylics Claire bought me, and I work there in the evenings after Lily goes to bed. It's not good yet. It might not ever be what it was. But I'm showing up, which is what Evelyn told me Gerald said about farming, and I figure if a 79-year-old woman can keep an empty room intact for 18 years on nothing but faith and stubbornness, the least I can do is pick up a brush. I call Evelyn every Sunday now. She asks about Lily. She asks about the painting. She tells me about the rose garden and the pie she's making and the book she's reading. We talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and it feels like the most natural thing in the world, like we're picking up a conversation that was only ever paused, never ended. Last Sunday, she said something I haven't been able to stop thinking about. I'd asked her, again, what had made her so certain I'd come back. I wasn't certain, she said. I was hopeful. There's a difference. Certainty is for people who've stopped paying attention. Hope is for people who know that things take time. She paused, and I could hear her settling into her chair, the creak of old wood and old bones. Besides, she added, I had room. I'm posting this because I spent 18 years believing that the past was something that only existed in memory. Fragile, unreliable, and ultimately lost. Evelyn Calloway taught me that some people don't just remember you. They hold a place for you. Not because they're certain you deserve it, but because they believe you might. And sometimes, that's enough to bring you home. Thank you, Evelyn. For the room. For the quilt. For the hope.